This is Voluminous, a listening books podcast for every kind of reader, but especially for fans of audiobooks. I'm Jessica Stone, and today we're taking a deep dive into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm here with Listening Books' own Abby Jaggers. Abby, what do you do here at Listening Books?
Hi Jess, I'm the membership and marketing assistant and general book lover of Listening Books.
And you're here to talk about Frankenstein.
Yes.
And the incredible writer who created him, Mary Shelley.
Yes.
And my first question to you is, why? Why Frankenstein? Why Mary Shelley?
Well, firstly, 2018 marks 200 years since Frankenstein was published in January, so I think that it's always a good time to talk about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, but this year is a particularly good time. I think also because, as we're talking about sort of horror books and disturbing books, it's coming up to Halloween. I think this is sort of the archetypal disturbing book. There's something very, very disturbing about it, that there's this almost human in it. There's the terrifying consequences of actions. And I think that unlike things like other sort of scary books, this is something to really frighten you at Halloween.
Yeah, and I think that word archetypal is so true as well. I mean, the way that it has worked its way into our sort of collective consciousness, I think, is phenomenal. And how did you first encounter them, and what form was that in? Was it through any of the films that have been made of it, or was it through the book itself?
I think, like probably most people, I was sort of aware of the idea of Frankenstein. As you said, it is this archetype. There's this cultural knowledge of it, which gets referenced quite a lot. So I was sort of vaguely aware of Frankenstein, but I didn't actually read the book or come across Mary Shelley until I was actually at university, so quite late. It was on my university course, and I read it as part of sort of a brief breakdown of 19th century literature. As you do. Yes. Fell absolutely in love with it. And I think, it's taught on a lot of earlier syllabuses now in schools, which is really good because I think more people should be aware of it. But Mary Shelley herself, I don't think I actually became sort of aware of her at the same time that I was reading Frankenstein. I think it took me quite a while to realise how cool she was, actually. Yeah. I mean, tell me about that. Like, when and why did she, as a person and not just a writer, grab your attention? I've always sort of been very interested in how we look at 19th century women writers as sort of like as a collective group. So how we rewrite them in a sense for each era. So particularly Charlotte Bronte, Jane Austen, and now Mary Shelley, we use them as sort of like and their works as this sort of cultural touchstone that we sort of see ourselves through, so like the Rochester or Jane Eyre and the Pride and Prejudice story, and also Frankenstein, these like archetypal characters that are written by these 19th century women writers. I'm just really fascinated by how we've sort of co-opted these women into our 21st century culture, and we've made them these icons when at the time they were not particularly considered iconic.
You were saying that she wasn't necessarily iconic when she lived. Yeah. In fact, she was quite a controversial figure when she was alive, I'd say. But she did have very, say, iconic beginnings. I mean, her parents, her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which is a very seminal feminist or pre-feminist piece of writing. She was not lauded for that. That made her a very not a woman you particularly wanted to associate with in sort of early 19th century literary circles. And then she, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft was married to William Godwin, like you said, who is he's a philosopher. He defends atheism, which again, early 1800s, not a big thing that you should be doing. Yeah, their parents are. They're scandalous. Yeah, and they're nonconformist and they're subversive. Yeah. And she, even though, say, Mary Wollstonecraft might not have been a popular person because she was writing very provocative things. And she died actually shortly after Mary Shelley was born, was Godwin then. So she never got to know her mother, but she was raised, I think, to revere her mother and to respect that kind of that nonconformity.
Yes, I think in lots of different ways, actually. William Godwin, despite the fact that they, like you said, she died quite early after Mary Shelley was born, so William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft weren't married for that long. William Godwin was clearly very much in love with her. So, yeah, he writes this memoir of her, and she's got these sort of high feminist ideals, but then from the memoir that William Godwin writes, she starts to be considered this sort of fallen woman, and people really reject her. But he doesn't really see that. He taught Mary Shelley to read by taking her to the grave of Mary Wollstonecraft and getting her to trace the letters on her gravestone, which... Yeah, I find that quite strange.
Yeah.
But from a lot of sources that I've read, they say, he wouldn't have found that odd. It would have been like a way of revering her mother. And also she reads a lot of her mother's work. She very much she very much knows that her mother was a scandalous woman, but she had these amazing ideas. And, Mary Shelley's really behind that.
So she's got these two subversive, nonconformist parents who are, her father anyway, is bringing her up to admire that legacy, to live up to that legacy.
Yes.
In some sense, sort of.
It's a legacy to live up to.
I think we're going to come back to that because I think there are elements of her story that just seem so unfair, and part of it is has to do with the expectations that she was brought up with, and how she was rewarded for living up to them.
Yes, in a sense. But I also think that she doesn't. So going sort of in, she's very young when she's famous, obviously, for marrying Percy Shelley.
Yes, the romantic poet.
Yes, Percy B. Shelley. But I think that when she first sort of elopes with him, I don't think she actually realises that that's something that will sort of bring shame upon her, in a sense, despite the fact that there's Percy B. Shelley. He is already married.
Yep.
He has children. His wife.
He leaves his pregnant wife to elope with Mary.
They have been meeting. Him and Mary. They've been meeting by the grave of her mother. And there's no
meeting.
Yes, there's no evidence that they ever had sort of sex at her mother's grave, but there are lots of things that point towards that, and I like to believe that because I think that's much more fun to tell the story about her.
I mean, if you needed a hook to be interested in her as a person, I think
it's very much the sort of thing that Percy B. Shelley would have done as well.
Yes, yeah.
I think
losing your virginity to a romance poet on the grave of your dead mother.
I mean, when you say it out loud like that, it really is ridiculous. But and she's also, at the time she's 15, 16. She's young.
Yeah.
But she knows she has her own mind. She's been brought up that way. She's been, William Godwin, he's this famous philosopher, and he has poets and famous people around the house. She knows William Blake was a friend of her mother's. Samuel Taylor Coleridge comes to the house to read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Wow.
She's brought up in this sort of artsy world as it is, so I think that maybe she wouldn't find it that odd.
Yeah, and yes, because the people around you kind of define your sense of what's normal.
Yeah.
Right? And she was surrounded by people who did not live according to the norms of the general society.
Yes, I think sometimes it's quite important to put it into context. So sometimes when I think maybe she was, I sort of forget that she was so out there for the time. I try to remember that actually Pride and Prejudice itself, the Jane Austen book, was published in 1813.
Yeah.
And Mary Shelley starts writing Frankenstein in 1816. You know, like 3 years later, this is when she's running off with Shelley. This is when she's having these trysts by her mother's grave. This is the same period.
Isn't that astonishing? Because I think it's easy to think of that time period of the 1800s in general. I realize that's a long time span, but but the 1800s in general, it's easy to think of it as a fairly buttoned up era. But in fact, buttons were popping all over the place.
Yes, and I think, you know, this is also, I think, the same thing that goes into Frankenstein. This is a time when, you know, science and romanticism, they're really at loggerheads. You know, so Percy is famously a very famous romantic poet, along with Byron, who the Shelleys were friends with. But at the time, she's being influenced by all these scientific, forward-thinking people. You know, there's this famous debate that goes on between two surgeons about what life actually is. You know, is it just the sum of your parts, or is it something that's sort of extra to your body? And all of this stuff's going on in the background of her life. And it's just, yeah, I think that it's no wonder really that she wrote something as really as interesting as Frankenstein, I think.
Yeah. Well, you know what, let's skip ahead a couple of years, because, you know, she got together with Percy, as we said, in 1814. And skipped off with him. When she came back, she was pregnant.
Yes.
And surprisingly to her anyway, her father completely rejected her.
Yes.
Her father, who was nonconformist and had thought that that marriage was an oppressive institution, he abandoned her, rejected her out of hand, I'd say.
Well, I mean, I say that, but you say that about William Godwin thinking that marriage is an institution, but of course you can't marry Percy Shelley because he is already married at this point.
Yes, exactly. So I'm not sure exactly which factors were figuring into his thinking there, but
yes.
But anyway, if we skip ahead then a couple of years to the summer of 1816, she and Percy are still together. They have a son.
Yes.
They head to Geneva with her stepsister, Claire Claremont, which I think is a great name, isn't it? Yeah.
And also, Claire is half of the reason that they end up going to Geneva.
Right.
Yeah, she's in love with Byron. They've had this tryst, and she's desperate to get herself her own romantic poet. You know, Mary Shelley's got Percy.
It's all the rage.
It's a big deal at the time. And so, her stepsister knows that Byron is in Geneva and somehow convinces Percy B. Shelley and Mary to trek across the mountains to Geneva, to where they sort of meet. They meet Byron at this villa.
It's his villa, I think.
Yes, it is his villa. Yeah, by a Genevan lake. There's some other. Claire is sort of obsessed with trying to be with Byron at the time. So it's
There's a John William Polidori, I think, a physician and writer. He's there as well.
Yes, it's a.
Yes, he seems a bit of a fifth wheel, I have to say, because you've got two couples, and then
but then strangely, I know we're probably going to talk about the Ghost Story Challenge in a minute.
Yes.
But strangely, so Claire is the only one that doesn't start writing anything on this trip. So Polidori does start writing something. Okay. So in a sense, yes, he's a bit of a fifth wheel.
But in the literary
sense, yes.
Got it. That's nice. They can take turns.
Yeah. There's always one in every group.
The conditions in which Frankenstein is born.
Yes.
They come from a challenge.
Yes. So they're spending this summer in 1816 in Geneva. And the summer of 1816 is very famous because it was actually, the whole of 1816 was called the year without a summer.
Oh, why was that?
This volcano, it's the other side of the world, but it's a huge volcanic explosion, and it blows all of this dust and stuff into the atmosphere. And it's the year before in 1815, but then by 1816, it's sort of having a nuclear winter effect on the Earth. Everything's dark, very cold. It's still snowing in June. Crops are failing. People all over Europe are starving. Yeah, the sun is feeling like it's going down at midday. It's really, there's these amazing sunsets because there's all this dust in the air. It really is like a end of times kind of year, really. So they go on this trip to Geneva, but despite it being the summer, they can't go outside and do any outdoor activities because there's about 4 hours light in the day. So they're sitting inside and they're reading ghost stories, which are really popular in Germany at the time. And Byron says, why don't we write one? A group of writers, and yes, it sort of spawns some of the two biggest sort of horror story things in the world. Polidori, he goes on to write a short story called The Vampire, which isn't published for years, but then ends up being the inspiration for Dracula later on. And Mary Shelley, after a few days, she gets this idea for Frankenstein. But she never reads it out at any of the parties or anything. It becomes quite private. But yeah, this is originally where the story starts, I suppose.
Yeah, and it sounds like the mood, the general atmospheric conditions in which she writes it are kind of similar to how we imagine the birth of the creature in Frankenstein as well, and how it's depicted.
I think it's also very interesting that the sort of the supporting structure of Frankenstein, so it's a lot of it's told through letters that are from a man called Walton, who's travelling in the Arctic to the North Pole, and I think that it's quite good that it's set in this sort of Arctic cold world, because what else would you imagine in a whole year that doesn't even have it's still snowing in June? And
actually, I mean, before we get too deep into the weeds here with the story, I have to confess that before we sat down to talk, I wasn't actually sure if I had read the story of Frankenstein.
I don't find that surprising, because I think a lot of people think they have read it.
Right, because it seems so familiar to us. Because, as you say, it has become archetypal, and so we sort of know the basics that, you know, a scientist creates something and it all goes terribly wrong. To put
terribly wrong.
Bad things happen. So I wasn't actually sure. So I ended up listening to one of the versions that's in the Listening Books library. I listened to the BBC dramatisation of it.
I've also listened to that.
Oh, have you?
It's actually a very good dramatisation of it.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. And while all the beats felt familiar to me, there was enough that surprised me as well, so that I was sure that I hadn't until then actually read the story. And I'm not sure if it counts that I've read it now because it was a dramatization rather than the...
Definitely counts.
Okay, all right.
You've experienced the story, it counts.
I've experienced the story, and not through a film adaptation, I suppose, or I mean, the way it kind of infiltrates, like, I'm sure it's shown up in The Simpsons, and
multiple times. Multiple times, I would imagine. I think it shows up in almost everything. You know, this, and I think that's what's so exciting about it is Mary Shelley. She's this 18-year-old girl. She's eloped with this romantic poet. They run off to Geneva, and she creates this story that's got two of the biggest archetypal characters that we still refer to today. You know, this, like you said, the sort of irresponsible scientist who pursues work that wouldn't pass an ethics committee.
Right.
And the sort of this almost human monster who is human, but also isn't human enough that it's terrifying.
Yeah. And so for listeners who maybe like me aren't entirely sure they know the actual story, let's just go through the plot as it happened, so that we're all on the same page. And I don't think we need to avoid spoilers at this point.
Spoiler alert. We are not going to avoid spoilers.
That's it. Yes. I think
the story is 200 years old.
Yes. And I think we, again, everybody's familiar with the general beats, but maybe the specifics might be nice to highlight again.
Yes.
Do you want to refresh our memories?
So, like I said, it starts in the Arctic with this sailor called Walton. He's on a boat going to the North Pole for some undefined science experiment. And on the way there, he comes across Victor Frankenstein, who is crossing the Arctic and is just absolutely near death. So he brings him on, Walton brings him onto the boat and sort of helps him recover a little bit. And then Victor Frankenstein starts telling his story and says, "This is how I ended up here." As you do. Yeah. You're found on the desert, on the Arctic wastes. How did you get here? So he sort of starts in his childhood. He's obsessed with the natural sciences. He goes off to university to sort of study. And he comes across this teacher who sort of helps him.
Well, he's obsessed with chemistry in particular, yes, right?
Yeah.
Which was seems like that was a kind of fledgling science, or that there were discredited scientists in that field that he was more interested in.
Yes, so
he's kind of warned away
he's interested in the ancients and alchemy.
Yes.
And then he sort of opened up his eyes towards chemistry, which is the new science, which is sort of just beginning. But he becomes just obsessed with the idea, and he gets this idea that he's going to create new life in this experiment, and he's working on it. And he discovers eventually the way to bring a body to life.
Which is not really defined in the book, as far as I can tell.
It's not, and actually I think
it's a bit hand-wavy.
Yes, it is very, and I think that's quite interesting, because I think in a lot of the film adaptations, which maybe people have seen, there's very much a standard. It's a light, there's lightning. The Frankenstein is laying on the bed. The lightning comes down. You flick the switch, and then he sits up, and none of that really happens. It's just sort of, it is very hand wavy. He discovers how to bring life back to dead organisms.
Yes,
and
he has assembled together.
Yes, he chooses
a humanoid.
I think this is the part where you really start to think, oh no, he's insane,
right?
Because he says that he's assembled the most beautiful parts that he can find,
yes,
and he's chosen them all so that this human will be as beautiful as possible, and it's 8 feet tall. And then he sort of magically, we don't really find how, brings life to this creature. But then as soon as the creature sort of sits up and is alive, he suddenly thinks, oh no, what have I done?
Right, you're hideous.
Yeah.
I hate you, go away.
Which, and at the time, the creature that just doesn't really know what's, he's just been born, really. Right. Frankenstein is then terrified and runs away. Mm-hmm. Great man. And when he comes back, he finds that the creature is gone.
And rather than be worried, he seems to be relieved by this. Which, again, makes you wonder if he wasn't quite sane.
I mean, there are many points where you really question, did you really deserve this life?
Yes.
And I think by the end of it, I did really start thinking, you deserved all of this to happen to you and more. But so he's sort of relieved. But then a few months later, he hears that his brother William has died. So he travels back to the family home, and the maid has been accused of killing his...
Justine,
yes. That's her name. Yeah. Has been accused of killing William, but the woman that he's been in love with his whole life is absolutely certain that it couldn't have been Justine. So he's sort of wandering around outside where William is supposed to have died, and comes across the creature who has gone back to the Frankenstein's home, yes, and killed William.
Yeah, so he's killed William. Justine gets blamed for it,
yes,
and hangs for it.
Yep.
Because nobody would, I don't think Victor even tries to explain that it was a creature that he created, because he's just sure that nobody would believe him.
I mean, nobody would believe him, and also he does not want to implicate himself. I think there is a real I don't think it doesn't really ever say that, but he really does. You really do get the impression that this is
a bit self-serving.
Yeah, this is a character who does not want to implicate himself.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the bodies are starting to pile up, through the course of this, about midway through, he encounters his creature again,
in the mountains,
who is able to actually, by this point, he's learned language and rational thought, and he's actually able to very reasonably give an account of why he has behaved this way. About from his point of view, he was created and then immediately rejected, and everyone who saw him saw a monster, and so he knew nothing but cruelty except for one blind man.
I think that's actually the very interesting part, actually, is that very early, this is the sort of central story. The story's set up in sort of three circles. So you've got Walton on the outside, who's ostensibly writing letters to his sister. That's the frame of the book. And then you have Frankenstein telling his story to Walton. And then on the inside of that, you then have the monster then telling his story to Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So this is the sort of central core of the book. It's right in the middle of the story. And right in the middle of Frankenstein's story is this really beautiful part where the monster, he tells that the only person that he's ever spoken to and who has spoken to him for rather than running away screaming is this blind man.
Yeah.
Because he can't see him.
And it is a really touching moment, actually, the account of that.
And I think it's really damning, actually. It's a damning indictment of society from Mary Shelley, where she just says, this is how we treat people. If you can't see them, you'll treat them as decent people. But, if you look at them and find this immediate horror, then you won't. Then you just immediately judge them. And I think this is the center of the story, if you sort of really boil it down.
So at this point, the creature, and your sympathies are entirely with him, I think, at this point, because it is clear he's been treated very unfairly.
Yeah.
But he has one demand of his creator, of Victor Frankenstein.
Yes, he says, make me a female creature.
Yeah. Real echoes of Adam and Eve.
Yes, not the only biblical allusion in the whole thing, but really a very much the creature actually says, I should have been your Adam later on. So this really is the anti-paradise that he's living in, and he he's the anti-beautiful man, and he wants his anti-beautiful woman to start up his new life. Yeah, so he asked Frankenstein for this, and to begin with, Frankenstein thinks, okay, I can do that.
Because the bargain is, if you do this for me, we'll go away, you'll never see us again.
Yes.
But if you don't, I'm going to kill everybody you ever loved.
I mean, at that point, you would start to think, okay, I will do this.
Right, yes.
So he heads over to England, where he knows that there's a scientist working there, and he starts, he sort of gathers together some more human pieces. I think that's something that we really gloss over in Frankenstein, about how horrible that is.
Was he grave digging to get these?
It's never really said, but I think the assumption is
practice by...
Yes, in order to get bodies for experimentation, a lot of people did do illegal grave digging. So that is sort of the implication here, that yes, he went around grave digging for particularly beautiful parts. So
nice.
Yeah, another moment of insanity. But so he's in the Orkney Islands, because it's as far away from society as he can get, and he starts making this female creature. But then as he's in the process of making, he spots the first creature, and thinks, what am I doing? I can't make a female creature. What if they reproduce?
Yeah, I mean, this is a bad time to be having second thoughts, to be honest.
If there's any time to have second thoughts, this is not one of them. And he rips up the female creature in front of his first creation.
Yeah, again, gotta question the timing and the decision making here.
He is extremely overdramatic, Victor Frankenstein. He really just does everything at the worst possible moment.
Oh, Victor.
So then, of course, his first creation comes up to him and says, what on earth do you think you're doing? You promised this to me. And Victor tries to make him go away. And then the creature says, I will come for you on your wedding night. Because obviously this is, supposedly the marriage of the creature and the female creature. He says that I'm going to take revenge on you.
I think we can probably wrap up the last bit in that by the end of it, he has killed his bride. Yes. Victor Frankenstein's bride.
Yeah.
And he has killed his best friend Henry.
Yes.
And framed him for it. and then Victor has tracked him to the North Pole to try to destroy the creature before he can do any more harm.
Yes.
But ends up dying himself before he can do that.
On the ship in the Arctic, yes.
Yes.
And then Walton, who's been listening to Victor Frankenstein's story, then sees the creature who has come onto the ship in order to see that Frankenstein has died. And the monster or the creature seeing that Frankenstein has died and is no longer pursuing him, realises that the only thing that is left for him to experience is death. Yeah. So he goes off.
And there's this really touching moment as well where he briefly wonders, where he hopes that there is nothing for him after death.
Yes,
that is a really devastating little touch.
I think Mary Shelley's very good at putting this occasional just twist. Real devastating emotional blow in her stories, and I think that, and yeah, you're right, that is one of them where you just think, oh no. I mean, you know, Frankenstein and the creature, they sort of mirror each other and they both do all these terrible things, but really it's, can you blame either of them?
Or both.
I
can definitely blame one of them, and and the other one we'll get to, I think. Before we get to that, I wanted to see if you could explain something to me and the listeners. The alternate title to Frankenstein is The Modern Prometheus.
Mm.
Can you tell me what the significance of that is, and who is or was Prometheus?
So sort of like a lot of the sort of Christian divine references like Adam and Eve and the paradise, this is a creation myth, but it's an ancient Greek creation myth. The character of Prometheus, he creates humans by moulding them through clay. And obviously, because it's such an old story, there are several versions. But in a few of the versions, probably the ones that Mary Shelley would have known, he steals fire from Zeus, and he uses the fire to give sort of knowledge and life to humanity, and also make them better than humanity, so they can use the fire. They get better than the animals around them, so they can use the fire in order to create culture and society. So this is obviously I think it's quite parallel to sort of Frankenstein in the book, in that, you know, Frankenstein, he uses electricity as like a life-giving element.
Yeah.
He uses electricity as a life-giving element to the creature to bring him alive, but Prometheus is very famously punished harshly by Zeus. He's chained to the mountains, and an eagle rips out his liver and eats it every day. But because he is immortal, it always seals up, and then every day he can have his liver ripped out. Does that
punishment seem proportionate, do you think?
I think it depends on whether you look at Prometheus in the same way that how you look at sort of the Garden of Eden story.
Yeah.
It depends on whether you think that Prometheus gave something good to humans or gave something bad. And I think that in the same way that you can look at the story in Frankenstein. Frankenstein, he creates this creature and he doesn't think at all about what he's doing.
And okay, so this brings to mind one of the central questions to me, which is about what the real sin, if we're using that kind of language, is in this book. Because the lesson I think that is most commonly gained from this, and that Victor himself seems to have learned from it.
Yes.
Because in his dying words, he tells Captain Walton to pursue tranquility and avoid ambition. So it's to him, the problem was his ambition. It was his overreach. And you can see echoes of that in, say, the Garden of Eden story, where the sin is one of overreach, of trying to be like God in knowing good and evil. And
I find that very interesting, because see, what I took from it is that the lesson is that curiosity without morality is bad.
Well, yes. So I'm not saying that this is the lesson that I've taken from it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'm saying that this is the lesson that I think is commonly associated with it, which is beware.
Yes. Science, should we do science just because we can?
Right. And I think it's a common kind of it's a common element in the myths as well, where don't get above yourself. Don't try to do what is the gods' job to do, that life and death are up to the gods, not to mortals. So there's that kind of plane where you could say, certainly Victor Frankenstein seemed to think that was where he went wrong, was in overreach.
Yeah.
But to me, the lesson was not about it wasn't about what ambition created. It was about what cruelty created.
Yeah. I agree, actually. I think that Victor, he becomes so narrow-minded when he's originally trying this experiment that ends up to go on creating the creature, that he doesn't think about anything else. He abandons his family, he stops writing to them, he sort of abandons his university, he abandons his friends. And I think that that's something that he goes on to learn from it, actually, is that his curiosity is not more important than the kindness of not doing something.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's the sort of cruelness of society, I think, is actually a very interesting message that comes from it, because Mary Shelley herself, in her youth, very young, sort of 13, 14, she suffers from this very intense skin disease, which may have been psoriasis or eczema. And this is at a time where skin diseases like that are sort of all lumped in under leprosy, which has quite a lot of
course, societal implications
baggage with it.
It's often used as a synonym for cast out.
Yes, and actually, she completely loses the use of one arm. It's covered in bandages. It's this huge bandage. She can't use it, and she's sent away to Ramsgate once, and then to Scotland. She experiences this cruelty in society, where people look at you and judge you for something where it might not be harmful. Psoriasis or eczema, whatever they were, if that's what they were, we don't know, are not harmful. We can't pass them on to anybody. But this societal baggage that comes with seeing something that looks bad and judging them, I think that is something that's definitely present in the morality of the book.
Yeah, and the way that fear distorts our perceptions of people and the way that we treat them. And that's not the only connection, I think, to Mary's personal life that I saw. I mean, we talked about when she came back with Percy, unmarried and pregnant, and how her father abandoned her, and that combined with the Adam and Eve story as well. There's this element of you made me like this. Why are you casting me out?
Yeah.
When you made me this way. In the case of her father, you brought me up this way, and now you've rejected me, but I am what you created.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, actually, because the monster refers to Frankenstein a few times as his father.
Yes.
It says, "You are my father. If I have a father, you're the closest. If I have a name, it is Frankenstein."
Yes, so say that to anybody who tries to correct you that Frankenstein's not the monster, it's the creator, but actually it's both.
Yeah, I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
He has, in a sense, birthed this creature. He's created it, and then immediately abandoned it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and it's this unwilling to take responsibility for what he's created as well. And that, to me, that has the closest echoes to sort of modern scientific advancement and our present concerns. I mean, it made me think of, I think, the inventor of dynamite, never envisioned or wanted it to be used for warfare.
Yeah.
And our concerns now about artificial intelligence and how far is too far, and and where could this go, and it's I suppose it's the ambition without any restraint imposed by compassion or by thinking through what the ramifications might be.
I think that's why this story still resonates and it's so important 200 years later, because science was just modern science was just sort of really beginning then, but those questions were coming up already, and they still come up all the time now. For example, we may have the technology now to recreate mammoths. Using DNA technology, we maybe could clone mammoths, but then...
But should we?
Yeah, exactly. Where do they go? Is there any place for them?
I mean, Jurassic Park.
I think I have always maintained that Jurassic Park is one of the most successful rewrites of Frankenstein.
Yes, I see that. I see that now, for sure.
Your sort of creation turns on you, but I think also a lot of blame goes on the Frankenstein's creature for turning on him, when actually I think what Frankenstein is actually learning is that his own hubris has turned on him rather than
Victor's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that is still very, very, very relevant today.
Yeah. I think I said that I'd come back to how I apportioned blame, and I'm not sure that I've actually measured it out so much. But I will say that whereas my sympathy was very much with the creature, particularly in that conversation that he has with his creator, with Victor Frankenstein, explaining how he had known nothing but cruelty.
Yeah.
My sympathies were with him up until the point where it's when he sees Justine, who's lying asleep, I think asleep or unconscious, and
he frames her.
And it's because he would love for her to love him. He wants female companionship, and she'd do. But he knows that were she to wake, she would scream and find him a monster. And his resentment of that is so great that he frames her and she hangs for it. And to me, that echoes so creepily and so eerily some of the rhetoric that you hear from men in, say, the incel movement, the involuntary celibates, where there's this sense of entitlement to female companionship and physical intimacy, and when that is to their minds withheld, then the reaction is resentment and sometimes violence, and so that to me definitely lessened my sympathy.
And I think that this is the question that I think Mary Shelley is sort of asking all the way through is, are we born cruel, or does society make us cruel?
Yeah.
Because is Victor Frankenstein a cruel person?
Just heedless.
Yeah, does he never... I mean, he does act cruel towards people. He doesn't come forward. He also allows Justine to go down. I mean, yes, the monster framed her, but he could very easily say, I know who did it. Yeah. It was me, essentially, by creating this. And I think this is something that Mary Shelley is sort of... I don't think she ever really gives an answer, though, because I don't know if there is an answer to that. But, is this creation that Victor Frankenstein made cruel because Victor made it and he's a cruel person? Or does society turn this monster cruel? And I think that that's still a question that we're grappling with in society today. And I think that that's why when I read those more difficult passages, you do want to sympathise with the creature, but he does say himself that when he's first created, he was innocent, and when he first kills William, he did it because he didn't know what else to do. He does it sort of by accident, in a sense.
Sorry, I panicked.
Yeah, I mean, that's no excuse, but he does it sort of by accident. And then after he's rejected society, that he then goes from sort of being fallen angel to actively a devil. And I think that, that's the line for many people. Where do you say that, oh, these unfortunate circumstances have made this person like this, or, and how much is personal choice? I think that's all the questions that she's grappling with here.
Yeah. So Frankenstein, still relevant today. If you, like me, realise that you hadn't actually read it up to now, I think we do encourage you to pick it up.
Definitely.
It's fantastic as an
very
audiobook,
short,
especially.
If that helps. It's not a 19th century 3-volume epic.
Yeah, no, it is quite short. I mean, I listened to the audiobook in 2 hours.
Yeah, it's very quick.
Yeah. And do you have anything more you'd like to say about Mary Shelley?
Of course, I always have more things that I want to say about Mary Shelley. I think one of the most, if you're still not sure if you're going to like her, and I don't know how you can think that, but if you're still not sure, I think this story will really interest you. So Mary Shelley, she's utterly in love with Percy Shelley, but Percy Shelley, unfortunately, he drowns quite early on. I think it's 1822, and possibly due to tuberculosis or something, when they go to cremate him, his heart is calcified and doesn't burn. Horrifying.
Wow. And
the heart is obviously passed on to his widow, Mary Shelley, and she keeps it in a silken shroud on her person for the rest of her life. And then when she dies, they discover the heart wrapped in one of Percy Shelley's poems in her desk. So she has kept it with her whole life, because nobody is more goth than Mary Shelley.
That is hardcore. Abby, thank you so much for taking time out of your
for having me.
Very busy day to geek out over Frankenstein and Mary Shelley with me.
Anytime.
Well, that's all from us, but we want to hear from you. Specifically, we want to hear about the best book you've read lately. Tell us what you loved about it. It can be any kind of book, any genre, any format. Find us on Facebook at ListeningBooks12 or Twitter at ListeningBooks. If you like this podcast, you can help others find it by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Next time, I'll be talking with Listening Books staffers Louise Barley and Jenny Ann Lewis on books that have brought on the waterworks.
And that made me cry in the bookshop.
The Luminous is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity providing audiobooks for people who have difficulty reading print, whether that's because of illness, disability, learning, or mental health. If that's you or someone you know, you can find out how to access our more than 7,500 titles, including Frankenstein, by heading to listening-books.org.uk.